Thank you for sticking around, because you are not going to want to miss the next presentation that we have by an eminent central banker here in Europe, former governor of the Cypriot Central Bank, as well as, of course, former ECB board member, and currently the professor of global economics and management at the MIT Sloan School of Management, Athanasios Orphanides. Okay, I pronounced it correctly this time. You're basically going to tell us how Europe is going to overcome the crisis, and hopefully talk about the elephants in the room that we didn't get to talk about earlier on stage. So.
Indeed, thank you very much. And it's not, I don't have a quiet period, so I can actually answer all of the questions that came up in the previous session.
Excellent. We'll be looking forward to that. Please go ahead.
Πρώτα μια πρόταση στα ελληνικά, μόνο μια πρόταση, να ευχαριστήσω τους διοργανωτές για την πρόσκληση σε αυτό το πολύ σημαντικό συνέδριο. Αλλά με αυτό θα πρέπει να γυρίσω στα αγγλικά και θα μιλήσω για την Ευρώπη και τις ανησυχίες που έχω για την Ευρώπη. In decades since the start of the euro crisis, the euro area remains quite fragile. Unlike other advanced economies, the economy of the euro area overall has performed much worse. And you can see this in a simple comparison of three of the world's largest advanced economies, the United States, the euro area, and Japan. All of them experienced similar severe slowdowns after the 2008 global financial crisis. But after a similar initial recovery, the euro experienced a further decline, and ever since has lagged behind the rest of the advanced world. Yet this is only one part of euro's problem. I would say the smallest of the problems we have in Europe. An even more significant challenge is that since the crisis started, the euro's economies have diverged. It is not the case that all have done somewhat worse than the rest of the advanced world. To the contrary, there is a clear division into winners and losers of the crisis. Compare four of the G7 economies, two of them in the euro area, Germany and Italy, two the ones I've shown you before, the United States and Japan. All four are advanced economies, very well developed, and before the crisis, there would have been no reason to expect that following a financial crisis, especially one that started in the United States, these four would have done much differently from each other. And then, as can be seen, the management, or if you prefer, mismanagement of the crisis in the euro area, has been such that one of the G7 economies and one of the largest member states of the euro area has performed extremely badly, and this is just a sign of everything else that has been going in the euro area and what has been happening in other countries that I don't need to mention in this forum. Actually, look at this chart as a manifestation of the challenge of inclusive growth that is the theme of this year's forum. So what are the causes of this unbalanced performance, both the problem of subpar growth in the euro area relative to the rest of the world, and also the immense divergence of prosperity within the euro area? Of course, one explanation in economics, given the noise we have and uncertainty about our theories, is that all of this is random and accidental. I wish this were true. I fear it's not. I fear that the other explanation may be more credible, and the other explanation is that what we're observing is a malfunction of the euro. And I feel strongly it's important for us to understand what the causes of the problems of the past 10 years have been, because if we don't understand, if we're unwilling to even acknowledge what has been causing the problem, I don't really see much hope in stabilizing the euro area going forward. Indeed, some would say that the euro's troubles are a predictable manifestation of the fragility of the political construction in Europe. predictable and unsurprising to some, because we can all recall that before the introduction of the euro, many economists, for example, in the United States, the majority of European economies based in the United States, were calling against the creation of the euro, pointing out that the European project was not yet ready for this undertaking. And indeed, this is what I want to talk about next. I think it's important to understand the fundamental weaknesses that are political in nature and not economic. The fundamental problem is that the European Union and the euro area are not a federation with a strong common government that can handle major crises, but rather a loose confederation. And let me tell you more precisely what I mean by that. Consider the proper response to a crisis, such as the crisis that hit the global economy in 2008. Good crisis management is about minimizing the total economic losses of the crisis, and also about ensuring a fair allocation of the losses among diverse stakeholders. This requires prompt action. Delays invariably raise the overall cost of any crisis. We all know that. It also requires decisions that can be politically costly for the authorities involved. In the euro area, this has proven problematic. The underlying issue is that the euro area is exhibiting the fragility that is inherent in all confederations. Without a common government tasked to protect the common good in an equitable manner, policy may be dominated by narrow national interests. The political leadership of individual member states are ultimately responsible for and accountable to the citizens of only their own member states. During a crisis, the bias towards protecting national interests may overwhelm other considerations, precluding a fair allocation of losses. Crisis management may end up protecting stronger member states that can leverage narrow national interests at the cost of the common good. Crisis losses can be transferred to weaker member states and their citizens. This, of course, would only feed tensions that ultimately lead to the unwinding of the European project, unless they are checked. In contrast to a federation that can protect the common good through a common government, confederations are fragile by design. There is an interesting historical precedent to the ongoing troubles in the euro area that's very close to home here that I'd like to talk about. It goes back a while. That's the Delian League. Of course, all of you in this forum will be aware of the history of the League, named after Delos, the small island in the Aegean Sea. It was a confederation of Hellenic city-states formed in the 5th century before the Common Era. At the time, this was the center of Europe. In some aspects, Delphi. In some other aspects, Delos. This was the center of Europe. And similar to the European Union today, the Delian League was a confederation of sovereign states sharing a common heritage and common interests. Similar to the European Union today as well, it was recognized that coming together was important to protect the region and the confederation from the rest of the world. At that time, in the aftermath of two costly wars with the successful defense of Europe, the threat was coming from the East back then, the alliance was seen as important for maintaining peace. And peace prevailed initially, and with peace came prosperity, and even a commonly accepted currency that became dominant in trade and finance in the Confederation. For a while, if you wish, the Delian League appeared to be a successful economic and monetary union. Let me remind you, the iconic silver tetradrachm coin was as much a symbol of the success of the Confederation 2,500 years ago as the euro strives to be a symbol of success in Europe today. And indeed, the €1 coin in this country has exactly the same depiction of the Athenian owl on it. But the success of the Confederation 2,500 years ago proved fleeting. What happened? What lessons can we draw? Well, the League was formed in 478 BCE as an alliance that respected equality among the member states. However, over time, the largest member states, Athens, which is somewhat ironic, developed undue influence on the common institutions, including the institutions controlling financial matters in the Confederacy. As a reminder, in 454, the Delian League's treasury was even moved from Delos to Athens, an event that marked the consolidation of power of the alliance by its largest member state. Effectively, the alliance evolved from a confederation of equal member states into an empire governed by its strongest member state. And the exploitation of the economic and monetary union by strongest state brought riches to its citizens. But this was at the expense of the citizens of the other member states. Now, we can still see the outcome today. Among others, it helped finance the golden age of Athens, including the building of the Parthenon we still admire today. The construction of the Parthenon started shortly after the funds were moved from Delos to Athens. Prosperity in Athens was not shared with its allies, and thus it could not be sustained. Hegemonic control by Athens brought resentment in the other member states, which led to tensions and rebellion. Exploited allies turned into enemies of Athens, eventually bringing about the destruction of the Athenian democracy with the end of the Peloponnesian Wars. In 404 BC, less than a century after its formation, the League was dissolved. Has the euro area been destined to have the same fate? Not necessarily. The euro malfunction observed over the past decade was not preordained. Confederations are weak by design because they lack a common government that protects the common good. The European Union was meant to encourage shared prosperity, however, and this was understood quite well by the proponents of the project. In the original design of the European Union, as enshrined in the treaties, strong, independent European institutions were envisioned to support the high-level principles of the European Union, promoting equality, solidarity, and ultimately the protection of the common good. This placed a high burden on European institutions. Unfortunately, the challenge proved too much, too difficult to handle in the face of the practical political realities and conflicting interests among member states. Before being tested, the ECB, for example, one of the most important European institutions, was considered a successful institution. It's like a fair-weather successful institution. But if we focus on monetary policy of the ECB since the euro crisis erupted a decade ago, a different story emerges. We can ask, has the ECB done all that it could within its mandate to minimize the economic losses of the crisis for the euro area as a whole? Has the ECB been supportive of the economy of the euro area in a manner that could be objectively termed equitable across euro area member states, as is demanded by the treaty? Well, let's consider first the overall stance of monetary policy. Since 2003, the ECB's aim has been stated as achieving and maintaining inflation close to 2% over the medium term. Before the crisis, this was interpreted and policy was pursued in a manner that delivered a symmetric 1.9% inflation goal. In contrast, over the past several years, the ECB has pursued a policy that the International Monetary Fund has characterized as lowflation, meaning systematically aiming to achieve lower inflation than what would be consistent with the central bank's mandate. Indeed, as you can see from the chart, the ECB has consistently kept core inflation to only 1%, in the euro area, well below its stated objective. Now, maintaining overly tight monetary conditions is not without cost. For the euro area as a whole, overly tight monetary conditions have resulted in lower incomes and higher unemployments. And as we've heard in the previous panel, lower incomes and higher unemployment means a greater prevalence of non-performing loans, worse problems in the banking sectors, and misery overall. Now, best practice monetary policy for the euro area as a whole would have avoided lowflation and would have guided inflation to be 1.9%, close to but below 2%. What could possibly explain the observed deviation of policy from best practice? Well, this is economics, so counterfactuals are difficult to construct. One explanation is always, this was just random and accidental. Well, maybe, yes. But what's troubling is that there may be alternative explanations. One sensitive issue in a monetary union is that what would be ideal monetary policy for one member state may be far from ideal for another member state. Policy corresponding to best practice for the euro area as a whole may be excessively easy for one member state and excessively tight for another member state. Comparing economic conditions in Germany and Italy, and we already know that one of them is a big elephant in the room these days, suggests that ECB policy may have been too tight for one of them and too easy for the other. Does this matter for the overall policy of the euro area? Well, in theory, it should not matter. However, in practice, it may. And deviation from best practice policy for the euro area as a whole could guide monetary conditions closer to what is ideal for a member state whose political authorities manage to exert influence on the common policy. Those who are more influential, even though ideally it should not be happening, may end up influencing the overall outcomes. Another not unrelated issue has been the encounter with a zero-layer bound on interest rates. The central banks of the United States, Japan, the euro area, as you can see in the chart, have had to bring policy interest rates down to zero after the global financial crisis. But this wasn't enough. Once zero is encountered, the policy interest rate is not enough to determine if policy is too easy or too tight. More policy easing was needed in all three of these economies. Well, what do you do? Well, at the zero-layer bound, additional easing is done by expanding the central bank's balance sheet. For example, through purchases of government debt, what is known as quantitative easing. And you can see from the chart, the Fed and the Bank of Japan have expanded their balance sheets by a factor of 5 since the crisis started. For the ECB to provide adequate accommodation in the euro area, it would have needed to engineer similar expansion. But QE has proven controversial in some member states, especially where QE is not needed. It's not ideal monetary conditions. Indeed, there have even been legal challenges against the ECB for doing what would have been natural, good policy in a normal situations. The end result has been considerably tighter policy for the euro area as a whole relative to best practice. Now, monetary policy mistakes are not uncommon in the history of central banking, and sometimes they're just purely accidental. What is more troubling is the possibility that the observed deviation from best practice that we have seen in the euro area in the past 10 years has been the result of undue influence by the political authorities in the member state that benefit from this deviation, at the cost to other member states and the euro area as a whole. And this is a problem. And this also suggests that the independence that, according to the treaty, should have been there in practice for this institution may not be quite as strong as it should be. But another deviation from best practice policy has proven even more damaging than the inadequate expansion of the ECB's balance sheet. This relates to ECB decisions that sustain the continuing fragility in the euro area. Since the beginning of the euro crisis, many euro area governments have experienced greater fiscal stress than governments of advanced economies outside the euro, with comparable or weaker fiscal fundamentals. The comparison you see in the chart between the government bond yields of Italy and Germany is illustrative of this fragility. And you can see this is not something that happened once and quickly gone away. Just in the last few months, we have yet another episode in this continuing crisis. So how does this relate to ECB policy? It is sometimes suggested that differences such as the differences in government bond yields that you see in the chart purely reflect fiscal policies. Fiscal policies, some say, make the debt of some countries safe and that of other countries unsafe, prone to rollover crises that could result in default. And fiscal policy is indeed very important. Perhaps then the explanation for what you see in the chart is that the Italian government has been overspending and accumulating large primary deficits, while the German government has been thrifty, registering large primary surpluses. But this explanation is false. In fact, the Italian government has been running substantial primary surpluses both before and since the crisis. Indeed, Italy has registered a larger primary surplus than Germany on average since the creation of the euro. A comparison with Japan is particularly instructive. Not only does Italy have a much lower debt to GDP ratio than Japan, and should have been considered at least as safe, Italy has also been running large primary surpluses, whereas Japan has been running deficits over the past 2 decades. And yet, Japan is the safe state, and Italy is not. Again, the explanation is not fiscal policy. Rather, the explanation is that running large fiscal surpluses is not sufficient to keep a country's debt safe. It also requires the country's central bank to implement policy in a reasonable manner that avoids unnecessary crisis. The difference between German and Italian yields can be accounted for by discretionary ECB decisions that have unnecessarily compromised the safe asset status of government debt in the euro area. Current ECB policy is to deny eligibility of a member state's debt as collateral for ECB open market operations unless it meets minimum credit rating thresholds. This may sound like a small technical detail, but it's not. It's actually what creates the problem that we have been seeing over the past 10 years. Effectively, what the ECB is doing, wittingly or unwittingly, is supporting what is known in the theoretical literature as adverse expectational equilibria in debt markets. This is something that Vitor Constancio, former ECB vice president, pointed out last year, right before he stepped out. I will not read you his quote, but the bottom line is that even if the fundamentals are strong, if policy is flawed, you're going to end up having a crisis such as the one we've seen in the case of Italy. So it's what the ECB has effectively been supporting. And I have to mention that this practice is unique among advanced economies and inconsistent with best practice for the implementation of monetary policy. Now, deviating from best practice in collateral policy is not without costs, but in this case, there are also immense distributional effects. While harmful to the euro area overall, and particularly to some member states, such as Italy, the ECB's collateral policy has been beneficial to some other member states, and particularly so to Germany. Inducing rollover risk and thereby making the debt of some member states unsafe poses an implicit tax to those states, like Italy. Their treasuries are forced to pay much higher interest rates to service existing debt. But this practice also generates a safe haven subsidy to states that are perceived as stronger. Their treasuries are effectively being subsidized by having to pay sometimes negative, very negative interest rates for rolling over their debt. So in effect, the ECB collateral policy has induced transfers from weaker member states to stronger member states in the euro area. In some sense, this is different from what Athens did during the Delian League. in some respects, is the same. So let me conclude. Confederations such as the euro area are fragile by design. However, the euro's failure was not preordained and is not necessarily irreversible. European treaties foresaw the need for strong, common, independent institutions. The ongoing failure of the euro reflects the sad reality that common institutions have been challenged and have not managed to effectively counterbalance narrow national interests. For Europe to move ahead, common institutions must reestablish their independence and use it to effectively counterbalance narrow national interests. Policy must respect equality of all the citizens of all the member states. Policy must be guided by the common good to deliver shared prosperity. The key to overcoming the crisis is shared prosperity. Thank you.